The amber eyes of the German shepherd locked onto something that made Officer Thomas Mitchell's blood run cold. Rex had stopped mid-stride in the bustling chaos of Chicago's Union Station, his muscular frame rigid as winter steel. Through the Christmas crowd of rushing travelers and laughing children, Thomas followed his partner's unwavering gaze. There, a little girl, no more than 8, her small hand pressed flat against a woman's blue coat. Not waving, not playing, signaling. The child's shoulders hunched forward, her brother clutching a dirty stuffed bear beside her. The woman's grip on their wrists was too tight, too controlling. Steam rose from coffee stands as Christmas carols echoed through the terminal, but Rex's low growl cut through the holiday warmth like a blade. Thomas had learned one thing in 20 years of police work. When Rex sensed danger, lives hung in the balance. What his four-legged partner detected next would expose a heart-wrenching truth that would shatter one woman's desperate delusion and save 2 innocent souls. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The December wind howled against the towering windows of Union Station, rattling the glass as snowflakes swirled in the bitter Chicago air. Inside, the Grand Terminal hummed with holiday energy, families dragging oversized suitcases, businessmen clutching steaming coffee cups, children's voices echoing off the vaulted ceiling decorated with garland and twinkling lights. The temperature outside had plummeted to 10 below zero, but the station's warmth provided refuge for thousands of travelers rushing to catch trains home for Christmas. Officer Thomas Mitchell pulled his patrol coat tighter as he walked the familiar route through the main concourse. At 55, his weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much, first as a soldier in Afghanistan, then as a Chicago police officer for the past 15 years. His salt and pepper beard couldn't hide the permanent sadness etched around his gray eyes, a grief that had settled there like winter frost that never quite melted. And beside him Rex moved with the fluid grace of a 7-year-old German shepherd in his prime. His thick double coat, perfectly adapted for harsh winters, rippled with each measured step. Those piercing amber eyes missed nothing, scanning faces, reading body language, detecting scents that told stories humans couldn't comprehend. Rex's exceptional nose could identify fear from 50 yards away, could smell the metallic tang of adrenaline through crowds of people. Thomas had been alone for 2 years now, ever since Sarah succumbed to cancer. Their small apartment on the south side felt cavernous without her laughter, her gentle voice calling him to dinner. But it was the older wound that cut deepest, losing 8-year-old Katie in that roadside bombing 5 years ago. She had been visiting him on base when the explosion tore through their world. Some nights, Thomas still heard her giggle in his dreams, still felt phantom tugs on his uniform sleeve. Rex had arrived 6 months after Katie's death, assigned as his K-9 partner when Thomas returned stateside. The dog seemed to understand grief in ways that defied explanation. On the worst nights, when Thomas sat staring at Katie's photograph, Rex would rest his massive head on Thomas's lap, amber eyes reflecting an ancient wisdom about pain and healing. Their partnership had become legendary within the Chicago PD. Rex's intuition bordered on supernatural. He had located missing persons, detected concealed weapons, and identified dangerous individuals with an accuracy that amazed veteran officers. But more importantly, Rex had kept Thomas tethered to life when despair threatened to pull him under. Now, as Christmas carols played softly over the station's sound system and the scent of cinnamon rolls wafted from nearby vendors, Thomas felt that familiar ache in his chest. The holidays amplified every loss, every empty chair at tables he would never sit at again. He glanced down at Rex, whose steady presence had become his anchor in a world that seemed determined to take away everything he loved. The afternoon shift at Union Station was usually routine, helping lost travelers, checking suspicious packages, maintaining order in organized chaos. Thomas had no way of knowing that in the next few moments, Rex would detect something that would change everything. It started with Rex's ears. One moment they were making their usual rounds past the Amtrak ticket counters, and the next, Rex's triangular ears had swiveled forward like satellite dishes, honing in on a distant signal. Thomas felt the change immediately through the leather leash, a subtle shift in his partner's gait, a stiffening of muscles beneath that thick winter coat. "What is it, boy?" Thomas murmured. But Rex had already locked onto something across the bustling concourse, his amber eyes fixed on a point near Track 7, where passengers were boarding the 3:15 train to St. Louis. Thomas followed that unwavering gaze through the maze of holiday travelers, past a group of college students dragging duffel bags, beyond an elderly couple studying a departure board with confused expressions. That's when he saw them. A woman in a royal blue winter coat stood near the track entrance, flanked by 2 children. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual, just another family catching a train home for the holidays. The woman appeared to be in her mid-40s, average height, with shoulder-length brown hair tucked beneath a knit cap. She held a small suitcase in one hand while keeping the children close with the other. But Rex saw something Thomas initially missed. The German shepherd's nostrils flared, catching scent molecules that told a different story than what the eyes observed. Fear had a distinct smell, sharp, acrid, unmistakable to a dog trained in detection work. It was pouring off those children like smoke from a fire. Thomas squinted, studying the scene more carefully. The little girl appeared to be about 8 years old, with blonde hair escaping from beneath a pink winter hat. Her younger brother, maybe 5, clutched a stuffed brown bear that had seen better days. Both children wore thin jackets inadequate for Chicago's brutal December weather, their breath visible in small puffs as they stood in the drafty terminal. Then Thomas noticed the girl's hand. While her left hand was firmly grasped by the woman in blue, her right hand was pressed flat against the woman's back, fingers splayed wide. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was deliberate, desperate. Thomas had seen that signal before years ago during his military service, used by hostages trying to communicate with rescue teams. A silent cry for help when speaking wasn't possible. "Jesus," Thomas whispered, his heart rate spiking. Rex responded immediately to the change in his handler's voice, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. The dog's hackles weren't fully raised yet, but Thomas could see the tension building in his partner's powerful frame. The woman seemed oblivious to the girl's desperate signaling, or perhaps she was deliberately ignoring it. She kept glancing at the large departure board above their heads, then checking her watch with increasing frequency. The 3:15 train's boarding announcement echoed through the station. "All aboard for St. Louis, with stops in Springfield and Jefferson City." Thomas began walking in their direction, maintaining a casual pace while his mind raced through possibilities. Rex moved beside him like a shadow, every sense heightened. The dog's training had taught him to read human behavior with uncanny accuracy. The micro-expressions of fear, the chemical signatures of distress, the subtle body language that revealed truth beneath surface appearances. As they drew closer, Thomas could see more details that troubled him deeply. The woman's grip on both children was tight enough to leave marks, her knuckles white beneath winter gloves. The little girl's eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting recent tears, while her brother appeared withdrawn, almost dissociated. Most telling was their body language. Both children leaned away from the woman, creating as much distance as their captured hands would allow. The stuffed bear clutched by the younger child caught Thomas's attention. It was well-loved but dirty, with one ear partially torn. More importantly, tied around its neck was a small ribbon, bright yellow, the color often used in missing children cases. Thomas's pulse quickened as pieces began falling into place. "Ma'am," Thomas called out as he approached, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years in law enforcement. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" The woman in blue turned, and Thomas immediately noticed her reaction. Instead of the mild annoyance or cooperation most travelers showed when approached by police, her face went pale. Her eyes darted between Thomas and Rex, then toward the train boarding area, calculating distance and escape routes. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice higher than natural conversation would warrant. "We're just trying to catch our train." Rex had positioned himself slightly ahead of Thomas, his massive frame creating a barrier between the woman and the children. The German Shepherd's amber eyes were fixed on her face, reading every micro-expression with the intensity of a predator studying prey. His tail was still, his breathing controlled, the stance of a working dog prepared for action. The little girl looked up at Thomas with eyes that reminded him painfully of Katie, blue-green, wide with a mixture of hope and terror. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then quickly closed it when the woman's grip tightened on her wrist. But her other hand continued pressing against the woman's back, the signal becoming more frantic. "These are my grandchildren," the woman continued, her rehearsed explanation tumbling out too quickly. "We're visiting family in St. Louis for Christmas. The kids are just tired from all the excitement." Thomas studied the documents she produced, 2 train tickets and what appeared to be identification for all 3 travelers. Everything looked legitimate on the surface, but Rex's continued agitation told a different story. The dog could smell lies almost as clearly as fear, his training having taught him to detect the physiological changes that accompanied deception. The younger boy had begun to tremble, whether from cold or fear, Thomas couldn't tell. His stuffed bear was pressed against his chest like a shield, and Thomas noticed something else, a small bruise on the child's wrist, partially hidden by his inadequate jacket sleeve. The children seemed distressed, Thomas observed, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Have they been feeling all right?" Before the woman could answer, the girl's desperate whisper cut through the ambient noise of the station. "Please help us." The words were barely audible, spoken while looking down at her feet, but Rex heard them clearly. The German Shepherd let out a single, sharp bark that echoed through the concourse like a gunshot. Nearby travelers turned to stare, creating a circle of attention that the woman in blue clearly didn't want. Thomas felt his world shift into sharp focus, the way it had during combat situations in Afghanistan. Every detail became crystal clear. The woman's increasing panic, the children's obvious relief at his presence, Rex's coiled readiness to spring into action. This wasn't a family catching a train for the holidays. This was something much darker, and his 4-legged partner had sensed it from the moment they'd entered the terminal. "Ma'am," Thomas said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority, "I'm going to need you and the children to step over here with me. We need to have a longer conversation." The woman's composure cracked like ice under pressure. "Officer, we really need to catch this train," she said, her voice rising with each word. "My daughter is expecting us in St. Louis tonight. It's Christmas Eve tomorrow, and the children will be devastated if we miss it." But Thomas had heard enough inconsistencies to know something was deeply wrong. First, she'd called them grandchildren. Now they were her children. Rex sensed the deception too. His powerful frame had shifted into full alert mode, muscles coiled like springs ready to release. The German Shepherd's amber eyes never left the woman's face, reading every micro-expression with the accuracy of a trained interrogator. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me to the security office," Thomas said firmly. "There are some questions that need answering before anyone gets on any train." The little girl looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of hope and terror. In that moment, Thomas saw Katie's face so clearly it nearly staggered him. The same blonde hair, the same frightened expression she'd worn during thunderstorms when she'd crawl into his bed seeking protection. But Katie was gone. Had been gone for 5 years, blown apart by a roadside bomb that had taken his reason for living. "These children don't belong to you, do they?" Thomas asked quietly, his cop instincts overriding the emotional tsunami threatening to overwhelm him. The woman, Margaret, he would later learn, took a step backward, pulling both children with her. "You have no right to detain us without cause. We haven't done anything wrong." Rex growled low, a sound that emanated from somewhere deep in his chest. The dog had positioned himself in a way that cut off their most direct escape route to the train platform. Other passengers were beginning to notice the confrontation, some stopping to stare, others giving the scene a wide berth while hurrying past. "The little girl asked me for help," Thomas said, taking a careful step closer. "That's cause enough for me." The boy, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, suddenly looked up from his stuffed bear. "Are you a policeman?" he asked in a voice so small Thomas had to strain to hear it over the ambient noise of the terminal. "Yes, son, I am. And this is Rex. We help children who are scared or lost." At the mention of his name, Rex's tail gave the slightest wag, though his attention remained fixed on the woman. The German Shepherd had been trained to provide comfort to victims while maintaining vigilance against threats, a delicate balance that he executed with remarkable intelligence. "We're not lost," the little girl whispered, her voice growing slightly stronger. "But we want to go home. We want to go home to Mommy and Daddy." Margaret's face went ashen. The careful mask she'd been wearing for weeks began to crumble, revealing something underneath that Thomas recognized immediately, the hollow-eyed look of someone drowning in grief. He'd seen that expression in his own mirror for months after Katie's death, after Sarah's diagnosis, after every loss that had carved pieces from his soul. "You don't understand," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I'm trying to help them. I'm trying to give them a better life than what they had." "By taking them from their parents?" Thomas asked, his training helping him maintain professional calm despite the rage building in his chest. "By putting them on a train to God knows where?" The Christmas carols playing over the station's sound system seemed obscenely cheerful against the backdrop of what was unfolding. Silent Night echoed through the terminal while 2 children stood terrified, stolen from their beds and their family, probably wondering if they'd ever see home again. Rex moved closer to the children, his massive head now level with the little girl's shoulder. She reached out tentatively with her free hand and touched his fur, finding comfort in his warmth and solid presence. The German Shepherd accepted her touch with infinite gentleness, his amber eyes soft with understanding that transcended species. "My name is Emily," the girl said suddenly, looking directly at Thomas. "This is my brother Jacob. We live on a farm in Iowa with Mommy and Daddy and our dog Rusty. This lady took us from our beds while Mommy and Daddy were sleeping." The simple, honest words hit Thomas like physical blows. These weren't neglected children being rescued from terrible circumstances. They were kidnapped babies torn from a loving home, transported across state lines by a woman whose motivations he couldn't yet fathom. Margaret began to sob, great heaving gasps that shook her entire frame. "You don't understand what it's like," she cried, "to lose everything. To have your whole world ripped away. These children, they need someone who understands love, who knows how precious they are." "They have someone," Thomas said quietly. "They have parents who are probably going insane with worry right now. Parents who are crying themselves to sleep every night, wondering if their babies are safe, if they're cold, if they're scared." Through his earpiece, Thomas heard dispatch crackle to life. His request for backup was being processed, but it would take several minutes for additional units to arrive. In the meantime, he was on his own with Rex, facing a woman who was clearly unstable and two traumatized children who needed immediate protection. The 3:15 train's final boarding call echoed through the terminal. Margaret's eyes darted toward the platform, then back to Thomas, calculating her rapidly diminishing options. Her grip on both children's wrists tightened to the point where Jacob whimpered in pain. "Don't hurt them," Thomas said, his voice carrying a warning that needed no elaboration. "Whatever you're going through, whatever pain you're carrying, don't make it worse by hurting these babies." Rex had moved into position between Margaret and the children, his training taking over completely. If she tried to run or became violent, the German Shepherd would react with the speed and precision that had made him legendary within the Chicago PD. But Thomas could see something in the dog's posture that surprised him. Rex wasn't just preparing to apprehend a suspect. He was reading the pain rolling off Margaret in waves, recognizing a wounded soul even as he prepared to stop her from causing more harm. "Ma'am," Thomas said, gentling his voice as much as his anger would allow, "I can see you're hurting. I can see you've lost something important, but taking these children isn't going to bring back whatever you've lost. It's only going to create more pain, more families destroyed by loss." Margaret looked at him with eyes that held depths of anguish Thomas recognized all too well. "I had a little girl," she whispered. "Sophie. She was 8 years old, just like Emily. She had the same blonde hair, the same laugh, and they took her from me. Life took her from me, and I couldn't do anything to stop it." The puzzle pieces began falling into place. A grieving mother, driven to desperate measures by loss and probably manipulated by others who preyed on such vulnerability. Thomas had seen it before, people so consumed by grief that they made choices they never would have considered in their right minds. "I'm sorry for your loss," Thomas said, meaning every word. "Losing a child, there's no pain like it in this world. But Sophie wouldn't want this. She wouldn't want you to hurt other children, other families." Emily had wrapped her small arms around Rex's thick neck, drawing comfort from his steady presence. Jacob had moved closer too, instinctively understanding that the big dog represented safety in a world that had suddenly become terrifying and unpredictable. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with multiple possible outcomes cascading through Thomas's mind. Margaret could run, could become violent, could have accomplices nearby. But looking at her face, seeing the genuine anguish there, Thomas made a decision based on intuition honed by decades of reading people in crisis. "Help me help you," he said softly. "Help me get these children back to their family, and let me help you find a way through your grief that doesn't destroy more lives." Margaret's grip on the children loosened as her defenses crumbled completely. The carefully constructed facade she'd maintained for weeks dissolved into raw, unfiltered anguish. "You can't possibly understand," she sobbed, sinking to her knees on the cold terminal floor. "Nobody understands what it's like to watch your child slip away and know you're powerless to save them." Thomas felt his own chest tighten with familiar pain. The memory of Katie's last moments came flooding back. The hospital room in Germany, the machines keeping her small body alive just long enough for him to say goodbye. The helplessness of holding her hand while life ebbed away, knowing all his strength and training meant nothing against the injuries she'd sustained. "I do understand," he said quietly, kneeling down to Margaret's level while keeping Rex positioned protectively near the children. "I lost my daughter, too. Her name was Katie. She was 8 years old, just like Emily here." Margaret's tear-streaked face looked up at him with desperate hope, as if finding someone who shared her particular brand of hell might somehow validate her actions. "Then you know," she whispered. You know what it does to you, how it hollows you out until there's nothing left but the ache where they used to be. Emily and Jacob had gravitated toward Rex, who had lowered himself to the floor to be at their eye level. The German shepherd's thick fur absorbed their tears as they clung to him, finding comfort in his steady heartbeat and unwavering presence. Rex understood trauma in ways that defied explanation, perhaps because he'd witnessed Thomas's own darkest moments and had learned to recognize the scent of shattered hearts. "I know the pain," Thomas acknowledged, his voice heavy with shared grief. "But Margaret, that is your name, isn't it? I also know that taking someone else's children won't bring Sophie back. It'll only create more mothers who know exactly how you feel." Through his earpiece, Thomas heard the crackle of backup units being dispatched. Detective Sarah Chen would arrive first, followed by FBI agents once the interstate kidnapping aspect was confirmed. But for now, in this moment, suspended between hope and tragedy, it was just him, Rex, and a woman drowning in the kind of grief that could drive someone to unthinkable acts. Margaret pulled a worn photograph from her coat pocket with trembling fingers. The image showed a beautiful little girl with blonde curls and bright green eyes, laughing at something off camera. "This was taken 3 weeks before the accident," she said, her voice barely audible above the terminal's ambient noise. "Sophie was riding her bike, and I was teaching her to pump her legs to go faster. She was so proud when she finally got it right." Emily, still pressed against Rex's warm fur, looked at the photograph with the startling empathy that children sometimes possess. "She looks nice," the 8-year-old said softly. "I bet she was a really good daughter." The innocent words seemed to shatter something inside Margaret. Her sobs intensified, echoing off the terminal's high ceiling. "She was everything," Margaret gasped. "My whole world. My husband couldn't handle the grief. He left 6 months after the funeral, said I was too broken to put back together. Maybe he was right." Thomas watched Rex carefully during this emotional revelation. The German shepherd's amber eyes moved between Margaret and the children, his canine intuition processing complex human emotions with remarkable sophistication. Rex had been trained to detect deception, but he was also responding to Margaret's genuine anguish with something approaching compassion. "After David left, I couldn't function," Margaret continued, her voice hollow with remembered pain. "I lost my job, couldn't pay the mortgage. The medical bills from Sophie's accident ate up everything we'd saved. I was living in my car when they found me." "They?" Thomas asked, his cop instincts sharpening despite his sympathy for her situation. Margaret's eyes darted away, shame coloring her features. "People who said they understood, who said they could give me purpose again. They told me there were children out there who needed love, who were being neglected or abused. They said I could save them, give them the kind of love Sophie would never get to experience." The pieces of a larger, more sinister picture began forming in Thomas's mind. Margaret wasn't just a grieving mother who'd snapped. She was a victim herself, manipulated by predators who exploited parental grief for their own twisted purposes. The trafficking ring she'd unknowingly joined probably had dozens of broken parents like her, people so consumed by loss that they'd convinced themselves they were rescuing rather than stealing. Jacob tugged on Rex's ear gently, and the German shepherd turned his massive head to look at the 5-year-old. "Are we safe now?" the little boy asked in a voice that broke Thomas's heart into smaller pieces. "You're safe, buddy," Thomas assured him, meaning every word. "Rex and I are going to make sure you get back to your mom and dad." At the mention of their parents, both children began crying again, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing they might actually see home again. Emily buried her face in Rex's thick neck fur while Jacob clutched his stuffed bear tighter, the yellow ribbon around its neck now clearly visible to Thomas as a beacon of hope left by desperate parents. Margaret watched this display of childish grief with an expression that shifted from possessive protectiveness to growing horror as reality penetrated the fog of her own trauma. "Oh God," she whispered, finally seeing Emily and Jacob not as replacements for Sophie, but as real children with their own lives, their own families who loved them. "What have I done? What have I become?" The 3:15 train to St. Louis departed without them, its whistle echoing through the terminal as it pulled away from the platform. Other passengers continued their holiday journeys, most oblivious to the human drama playing out in their midst. But a few observant travelers had lingered, sensing something significant was happening, perhaps recognizing the children from news reports about missing kids from Iowa. Detective Chen arrived with backup officers, her experienced eyes immediately assessing the situation. Thomas had worked with her on dozens of cases over the years, and she could read him almost as well as Rex could. She saw the emotional complexity written across his face, understood without explanation that this wasn't a simple arrest. "Margaret Henderson?" Chen asked gently, crouching down near the devastated woman. "We've been looking for you and the children. Their parents are worried sick." At the mention of Emily and Jacob's parents, Margaret's last vestige of self-justification crumbled. "I told myself I was saving them," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I told myself their parents didn't deserve them, that I could love them better. But I was lying, wasn't I? I was stealing them because I couldn't bear to be alone anymore." Thomas felt Rex shift beside him, the dog's attention now divided between protecting the children and monitoring Margaret's emotional state. The German Shepherd seemed to understand that she was no longer a threat, just another wounded soul in need of healing. Rex had an uncanny ability to differentiate between malicious intent and misguided desperation. "Mrs. Henderson," Thomas said carefully, "I need you to tell me about the people who recruited you, the ones who told you this was saving children rather than destroying families. Can you help us stop them from hurting other people the way they've hurt you?" Margaret nodded through her tears, perhaps finding some small measure of redemption in the possibility of preventing others from walking her tragic path. "There are others," she said, her voice growing stronger with purpose. "Other parents like me who lost children. They prey on people like us, people with nothing left to lose." Emily looked up from Rex's fur, her young face serious beyond her years. "My mommy cries sometimes when she thinks I can't see," she said to Margaret. "She cries because she misses her mommy who went to heaven, but she never took somebody else's little girl." The simple wisdom of a child's observation hung in the air like a judgment more powerful than anything the courts could deliver. Margaret closed her eyes, finally understanding the full magnitude of what she'd done and what she'd become in her desperate attempt to fill the Sophie-shaped hole in her heart. The situation escalated rapidly when Margaret's phone began buzzing with increasingly frantic messages. Thomas watched her face go pale as she read the texts, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the device. "They know something's wrong," she whispered, terror replacing the grief that had consumed her moments before. "They're asking why we missed the train. They're threatening to hurt other children if I don't respond." Detective Chen immediately called for FBI backup while Thomas felt Rex's body tense beside him. The German Shepherd's ears had perked up, his nose twitching as he detected new scents in the air, the metallic tang of adrenaline from multiple sources, the chemical signatures of fear and aggression that preceded violence. "Margaret, who are they?" Thomas demanded urgently. "How many people are we talking about?" "Are any of them here at the station?" Before she could answer, a man in a dark overcoat approached from the direction of the food court. He appeared casual, just another holiday traveler, but Rex's low growl indicated otherwise. The dog had identified something threatening about the stranger's gait, his purposeful movement through the crowd despite his attempt to look aimless. "That's Vincent," Margaret gasped, recognizing him immediately. "He's one of the recruiters. He must have been watching to make sure we got on the train." The man, Vincent, was still 50 yards away, but Thomas could see him scanning the area near Track 7, looking for Margaret and the children. His hand kept moving to his jacket pocket in a gesture that made Thomas's military training scream warnings. Concealed weapon, possibly armed backup nearby, innocent civilians everywhere who could become collateral damage. "Chen, we need to clear this area now," Thomas said quietly into his radio, never taking his eyes off Vincent. "Suspect is armed and approaching. Children are priority one." Emily and Jacob sensed the shift in tension immediately, the way children always do when adults around them become afraid. They pressed closer to Rex, who had positioned his massive body between them and the approaching threat. The German Shepherd's protective instincts were fully engaged now. This was no longer about comforting traumatized children, but about defending them from active danger. Vincent's eyes found Margaret kneeling on the terminal floor, surrounded by police officers and clearly not boarding any train. Thomas saw the moment recognition hit, watched the man's casual facade drop as his hand moved decisively toward his jacket. But Vincent made a crucial mistake. He underestimated Rex. The German Shepherd launched himself forward with explosive power, covering 20 feet in seconds before Vincent could fully draw his weapon. Rex's training kicked in with lethal precision, not to kill, but to neutralize the threat with minimal risk to bystanders. His powerful jaws clamped down on Vincent's gun arm while his weight drove the man to the ground. Screams erupted throughout the terminal as holiday travelers suddenly realized they were in the middle of a dangerous situation. Parents grabbed their children and ran for exits while business travelers dove behind benches and luggage carts. The peaceful Christmas atmosphere shattered like glass, replaced by the chaos of active law enforcement action. "Gun down! Suspect subdued!" Thomas shouted into his radio while rushing to support Rex. But even as he moved, his peripheral vision caught movement from two other directions, more members of the trafficking ring positioned strategically throughout the terminal, now converging on their location. Detective Chen had drawn her weapon and was directing the backup officers who were flooding into the concourse. But Thomas realized with growing horror that this wasn't just about Margaret and two kidnapped children. This was a coordinated operation with multiple moving parts, and they had walked into the middle of it. "Margaret!" Thomas called out urgently. "How many others are there? How many people were involved in taking these children?" "I don't know," she sobbed, her mental state deteriorating rapidly under the stress. "They only told me what I needed to know." Vincent said there were others watching, making sure everything went smoothly, but I never saw them all together. Rex maintained his grip on Vincent's arm while the man writhed beneath him, cursing and struggling futilely against the German Shepherd's superior strength. Blood seeped through Vincent's jacket where Rex's teeth had found purchase, but the dog's training prevented him from inflicting more damage than necessary to neutralize the threat. Emily's scream cut through the chaos like a blade. "Jacob!" Thomas spun around to see a woman in a red coat grabbing the 5-year-old boy, lifting him bodily while he kicked and struggled. She was moving quickly toward a service exit, clearly another member of the trafficking ring attempting to salvage the operation by securing at least one child. "Rex, stay with Vincent," Thomas commanded, trusting his partner to maintain control of the subdued gunman while he pursued the new threat. The German Shepherd acknowledged with a slight shift of his amber eyes, never relaxing his vigilant grip. Thomas ran after the woman and Jacob, his years of military and police training allowing him to navigate the panicking crowd with deadly efficiency. But the woman had a significant head start and knew the terminal layout better than he did. She disappeared through the service door with Jacob's terrified cries echoing behind her. "Officer down!" came Chen's voice over the radio, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. Thomas's blood ran cold as he realized a third member of the trafficking ring had engaged the other officers, turning Union Station into an active battlefield with hundreds of innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. Margaret's hysterical screaming added to the cacophony as she watched Jacob disappear, finally understanding the full horror of what she'd become involved in. These weren't people who rescued children. They were predators who stole them, and she had been their unwitting accomplice in a crime far more extensive than she'd ever imagined. "Emily, stay with Detective Chen!" Thomas shouted as he reached the service door. But the 8-year-old girl was beyond rational thought, traumatized by seeing her little brother taken again just when she thought they were safe. The service corridor beyond the door was dimly lit and lined with storage rooms and mechanical equipment. Thomas could hear Jacob's cries echoing from somewhere ahead, but the acoustics made it impossible to pinpoint the exact location. His service weapon was drawn, but he had to be careful. One wrong shot in these confined quarters could ricochet and hit the child. Rex's commanding bark echoed from the main terminal behind him, followed by more shouts and the sound of running feet. The German Shepherd was clearly maintaining control of his prisoner while trying to coordinate the response to multiple threats. Thomas had never been more grateful for his partner's intelligence and training. "Chicago PD!" Thomas called out as he moved deeper into the service area. "Release the child and surrender peacefully." A woman's voice responded from somewhere in the maze of corridors. "Back off, or the boy gets hurt. This doesn't have to end badly for anyone." But Thomas knew better. People who trafficked children didn't hesitate to harm them when cornered. Jacob's life hung in the balance, and every second that passed reduced their chances of getting him back safely. The little boy who had clutched his stuffed bear and asked if they were safe was now facing a nightmare that would scar him forever if he survived it. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air outside as FBI units and additional Chicago PD officers responded to the crisis. But Thomas knew that by the time they established a perimeter and coordinated a response, it might be too late for Jacob. The trafficking ring had clearly planned for contingencies, and they were executing their escape protocol with ruthless efficiency. Margaret's anguished voice carried through the service door. "This is all my fault. I did this to them. I helped these monsters steal babies." Her words echoed Thomas's own worst fears, that his moment of compassion, his attempt to help a grieving mother, had somehow made the situation worse, that Jacob might pay the ultimate price for Thomas's failure to recognize the full scope of the threat they were facing. The corridor ahead remained ominously silent except for the mechanical hum of the building's systems. Somewhere in that darkness, a 5-year-old boy waited for rescue, clutching a stuffed bear and wondering if the police officer who had promised safety would keep his word. The gunshot that echoed through the service corridor shattered Thomas's world, not the sharp crack of his service weapon or the woman's gun, but something far worse, the sound of a child's scream cut brutally short. Jacob's voice, which had been calling for his sister just moments before, went suddenly, terrifyingly silent. "No!" Thomas roared, abandoning stealth as he charged through the dimly lit corridor. His boots pounded against concrete floors slick with condensation from the building's heating system. The mechanical hum of ventilation units masked his approach, but it also concealed any sounds that might tell him whether Jacob was still alive. He found them in a storage room filled with maintenance equipment. The woman in the red coat stood over Jacob's small form, her smoking gun still pointed downward. The 5-year-old lay motionless on the cold concrete, his stuffed bear just beyond his outstretched fingers, the yellow ribbon around its neck now stained with something dark. "Drop your weapon," Thomas screamed, his own gun trained on the woman's chest. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew he was too late. The child who had trusted him to keep him safe, who had asked if the police would help him go home to his mommy and daddy, lay still in a spreading pool of blood. The woman looked at Thomas with eyes devoid of any humanity. "He was screaming too much," she said with casual indifference, as if explaining why she'd stepped on an insect. "Bad for business when they make noise." Something primal and violent erupted inside Thomas's chest, a rage so pure and consuming it threatened to override 20 years of training and professional conduct. This woman had just executed a 5-year-old child in cold blood, had stolen the future from a little boy whose only crime was being born into a world where monsters wore human faces. "You killed him," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking with anguish that went beyond professional duty into something deeply personal. "You killed a baby." The woman shrugged, already looking toward an exit door that would lead to the station's loading docks. Collateral damage. There are always more where he came from. But as she moved to step over Jacob's body, the impossible happened. The little boy's eyes fluttered open, and a weak cry escaped his lips. The bullet had grazed his head, knocking him unconscious and causing significant bleeding, but had somehow missed his brain. Jacob was alive, traumatized, wounded, but breathing. The moment of hope was shattered when Rex's agonized howl echoed through the terminal's main concourse. Even through walls and distance, Thomas could hear his partner's distress, not the controlled bark of a working dog, but the primal cry of an animal in mortal pain. Through his earpiece came Detective Chen's broken voice. "Officer down! Rex is down! We need paramedics now!" The words hit Thomas like physical blows. While he'd been chasing Jacob's kidnapper, something had happened to Rex. His partner, his anchor to sanity, his four-legged brother who had pulled him back from the brink of suicide more nights than he could count. Rex was hurt, possibly dying, while Thomas stood helpless in a storage room with a wounded child and a killer. The woman in red saw Thomas's moment of devastation and used it to her advantage. She bolted for the exit door, leaving her gun behind in her haste to escape. Thomas faced an impossible choice: pursue the killer and leave Jacob alone and bleeding, or stay with the wounded child and let a child murderer escape to kill again. There was no choice at all. Thomas holstered his weapon and dropped to his knees beside Jacob, pressing his hands against the boy's head wound to stem the bleeding. "Stay with me, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with tears he couldn't hold back. "Your sister is waiting for you. Your mom and dad are coming to take you home." But Jacob's eyes were glazing over, the blood loss more severe than Thomas had initially realized. The little boy's lips moved soundlessly, trying to form words that wouldn't come. Thomas could see the life fading from eyes that reminded him so painfully of Katie's last moments in that German hospital room. "I'm sorry," Thomas sobbed, his professional composure completely shattered. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you better. I promised you'd be safe, and I failed you." Jacob's small hand found Thomas's arm, gripping with surprising strength. The 5-year-old was fighting to stay conscious, fighting to live, with the same determination his sister had shown throughout their ordeal. His stuffed bear lay just out of reach, the yellow ribbon now a memorial to innocence destroyed. Through the open door came the sounds of chaos from the main terminal: shouts, sirens, the organized pandemonium of a major crime scene. But Thomas could also hear something else that broke his heart into smaller pieces. Emily's voice, calling frantically for her brother. "Jacob, Jacob, where are you? Tommy the policeman, where's my brother?" She was using his first name the way Katie used to, with the casual intimacy children reserved for adults they trusted completely. The irony was devastating. Emily still believed in him, still trusted him to bring her brother back safely, even as Jacob's life leaked out between Thomas's fingers. Paramedics burst through the service door, their equipment clattering as they rushed to Jacob's side. Thomas reluctantly gave way to their expertise, watching helplessly as they worked to stabilize the critically wounded child. But even the most skilled medical intervention couldn't erase what had happened: a 5-year-old boy shot in the head because adults had failed to protect him. "Rex?" Thomas asked one of the paramedics, his voice barely audible. The medic's expression told him everything he needed to know. "He's alive, but it's bad. multiple gunshot wounds. They're working on him now. Thomas felt something inside his chest break completely. Rex, who had never hesitated to put himself between danger and innocent victims. Rex, who had sensed the trafficking ring's presence from the moment they'd entered the terminal. Rex, who had probably died protecting Emily while Thomas was failing to save Jacob. Detective Chen appeared in the doorway, her uniform torn and blood-stained. "Vincent and his partner are in custody," she reported, but her voice carried no triumph. "The woman in red escaped through the loading dock. We have units searching the area, but—" She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew the killer was probably already gone, disappeared into Chicago's urban maze to strike again somewhere else, against some other family, some other innocent children. "Emily's asking for you," Chen said quietly. "She keeps saying she wants to see Tommy the policeman and her brother. We haven't told her about Jacob's condition yet." Thomas looked down at his hands, still stained with a child's blood. How could he face Emily knowing he'd failed to protect the most important thing in her world? How could he explain to an 8-year-old girl that sometimes the police couldn't keep their promises, that sometimes the monsters won despite everyone's best efforts? The paramedics were preparing to transport Jacob to Chicago Children's Hospital, their movements urgent but controlled. The little boy was unconscious now, his face pale beneath the bandages wrapped around his head. His stuffed bear rode in the ambulance with him, its yellow ribbon a small beacon of hope in an ocean of despair. As Thomas followed the gurney back toward the main terminal, he could hear Rex's labored breathing from where the veterinary team was working on him. His partner was fighting for every breath, just as Jacob was fighting for every heartbeat. Two innocents wounded because adults had created a world where children became commodities to be bought and sold. Margaret sat in handcuffs near the ticket counter, her face streaked with tears and something that might have been blood. When she saw Thomas approaching, her expression crumpled with guilt and self-recrimination. "I did this," she whispered as he passed. "I helped them hurt those babies. Sophie would be ashamed of what I became." Thomas stopped, looking down at the woman whose grief had been weaponized by predators who understood how to turn love into something monstrous. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She would be. But Sophie's gone, Margaret. She's been gone for 3 years, and nothing you do to other people's children will bring her back." The words were harsh, but necessary, a final judgment on choices that had led to this moment of tragedy. Margaret nodded through her tears, accepting responsibility for horrors she couldn't undo. Emily ran toward Thomas the moment she saw him, her small arms wrapping around his waist with desperate strength. "Where's Jacob?" she asked, looking up at him with eyes full of trust he no longer deserved. "Is my brother okay? Is Rex okay? Why is everyone crying?" Thomas knelt down to her level, gathering this brave little girl into his arms while his own heart shattered completely. Somewhere behind them, paramedics worked frantically to save her brother's life. Somewhere else, veterinarians fought to keep Rex breathing. And somewhere in the city, a woman who murdered children walked free because he had chosen compassion over capture. The Christmas carols still played over the terminal's sound system, their cheerful melodies a mockery of the blood and tears that stained Union Station's floors. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men, beautiful sentiments that meant nothing when faced with the reality of human evil and the price paid by innocence. "We're going to take care of you," Thomas whispered into Emily's hair, making the only promise he had left to give. "Whatever happens, I'm going to make sure you're safe." But as he held her small, trembling body against his chest, Thomas wondered if he was just making another promise he wouldn't be able to keep. The revelation came 12 hours later, when Jacob finally regained consciousness in the pediatric intensive care unit. His first words, whispered through bandages and tubes, changed everything Thomas thought he knew about the case. "The lady, she wasn't trying to hurt me. Jacob said weakly, his small voice barely audible above the beeping monitors. She was crying. She said she was sorry. Thomas leaned closer to the hospital bed. Emily's hand clutched tightly in his own. The 8-year-old hadn't left her brother's side since the doctors had stabilized his condition, refusing food and sleep until she could hear his voice again. "What do you mean, buddy?" Thomas asked gently, though something cold was already forming in the pit of his stomach. Jacob's eyes, still clouded with pain medication, struggled to focus. The gun went off when she dropped it. She was shaking really bad. She kept saying, "I can't do this anymore. I can't hurt any more babies." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, an accidental discharge. The woman in red hadn't executed Jacob in cold blood. She'd been having a breakdown, and the weapon had fired when her trembling hands lost control. Everything Thomas had believed about those crucial moments in the storage room was wrong. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, Jacob's surgeon, approached with a tablet in her hands and an expression that mixed medical professionalism with deep concern. "Officer Mitchell, I need to show you something. The ballistics report just came in, and it raises some serious questions." The tablet displayed X-ray images and trajectory analysis that painted a picture completely different from what Thomas had witnessed. The bullet had ricocheted off a metal pipe before grazing Jacob's skull. The angle was all wrong for a deliberate execution. It was consistent with a dropped weapon firing accidentally. "There's more," Dr. Hernandez continued quietly. "The blood work shows the woman had extremely high levels of anxiety medication and alcohol in her system. Combined with what Jacob is telling us about her behavior, it appears she was having a severe psychological break." Emily looked up at Thomas with confusion written across her young face. "What does that mean? Was the Red Lady trying to help us?" Before Thomas could formulate an answer that an 8-year-old could understand, Detective Chen appeared in the doorway with news that complicated the situation even further. "Thomas, we need to talk. Now." They stepped into the hallway, leaving Emily holding her brother's hand while a nurse monitored his vitals. Chen's expression was grim, carrying the weight of information that would reshape their understanding of the entire case. "We found Linda Morrison," Chen said without preamble. "That's the woman in red. She's dead." Thomas felt the world tilt slightly. "Dead? How? When?" "Suicide. She left a detailed confession at a hotel room downtown. Thomas, she wasn't a trafficking ring member. She was another victim they recruited, just like Margaret." The confession, written in Linda's shaking handwriting on hotel stationery, painted a picture of manipulation and exploitation that made Thomas's stomach churn. Linda Morrison had lost her 6-year-old son to leukemia 18 months earlier. Her husband had blamed her for not catching the cancer sooner, filing for divorce and taking their surviving daughter across the country. Vincent and his associates had found Linda at a grief support group, identifying her as the perfect target for recruitment. They told her the same lies they'd told Margaret, that she would be saving neglected children, giving them better lives. They fed her anxiety medication to keep her compliant and alcohol to numb her conscience. "The shooting was accidental," Chen continued, reading from the confession. "Linda wrote that she couldn't go through with taking Jacob. She was dropping the gun when it discharged. She thought she'd killed him." Thomas sank into a plastic hospital chair, his mind reeling with the implications. The woman he'd been ready to shoot, the monster he'd judged so harshly, was just another broken parent being used by actual predators. Linda Morrison had died believing she was a child killer, when in reality she was a victim who'd tried to do the right thing at the last moment. "Vincent's been talking," Chen added, "trying to cut a deal. He's given us names, locations, methods of operation. This trafficking ring has been operating for over 5 years, specifically targeting grieving parents. They have dozens of people like Margaret and Linda scattered across the Midwest." The systematic nature of the exploitation was staggering. Vincent's organization didn't just steal children, they manufactured kidnappers by preying on people at their most vulnerable moments. Parents who'd lost children were perfect candidates, desperate, isolated, and motivated by a twisted form of love that could be redirected toward criminal purposes. How many others? Thomas asked, dreading the answer. At least 47 cases we can identify so far. Most of the recruits didn't know they were part of a trafficking operation. They thought they were part of some kind of underground railroad for abused children. Emily appeared in the doorway, her small face streaked with tears. "Tommy, Jacob wants to see Rex. He keeps asking when Rex is coming to visit." The innocent question hit Thomas like another blow. Rex was barely clinging to life in the veterinary hospital across town, his chest riddled with bullets taken while protecting Emily from Vincent's partner. The German Shepherd had thrown himself between the gunman and the little girl, absorbing wounds that should have killed him instantly. Thomas knelt down to Emily's eye level, struggling to find words that would make sense to a child who'd already endured more trauma than most adults faced in a lifetime. "Rex is hurt pretty badly, sweetheart. The doctors are taking really good care of him, but he needs time to get better." "Like Jacob needed time?" she asked, with the logical directness of childhood. "Yeah, like Jacob. But Rex is tough, and he knows you're waiting for him." The partial truth felt inadequate, but Emily nodded solemnly and returned to her brother's bedside. Thomas watched her go, this remarkably resilient 8-year-old who'd protected her brother throughout their ordeal and now refused to leave his side. She reminded him so much of Katie it was physically painful. Margaret appeared at the end of the hallway, flanked by 2 federal agents, but no longer in handcuffs. Her cooperation with the investigation had earned her a degree of freedom, though her legal situation remained complicated. She approached slowly, her face a mask of guilt and desperate hope. "How is he?" she asked, nodding toward Jacob's room. "How is the little boy I helped them hurt?" "He's going to recover," Thomas said carefully. "Physically, at least. The emotional scars will take longer to heal." Margaret's tears began falling again, as they had almost constantly since her arrest. "I convinced myself I was saving them. I looked at Emily and saw Sophie, and I thought if I could give them a good home, if I could love them the way Sophie should have been loved." "You weren't thinking clearly," Thomas said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "They exploited your grief, Margaret. They turned your love for Sophie into a weapon. But I still chose to take those children. I still put them in that situation. No matter what Vincent told me, no matter how much pain I was in, I made the choice to steal someone else's babies." The self-awareness in her voice was heartbreaking. Margaret understood the magnitude of her crimes while also recognizing how she'd been manipulated. She was simultaneously perpetrator and victim, guilty and innocent, deserving of punishment and compassion. Dr. Hernandez appeared again, this time with news that lifted some of the weight from Thomas's chest. "Jacob's neurological responses are excellent. The injury looks much worse than it is. He should make a full recovery with minimal scarring and no cognitive impairment." Emily's whoop of joy echoed down the hospital corridor, followed by Jacob's weak but happy laughter. For the first time in 24 hours, Thomas allowed himself to feel something approaching hope. These children would survive. They would go home to their parents. They would heal. But as he looked at Margaret's tormented face, Thomas realized the true scope of Vincent's crimes. It wasn't just about the children who'd been stolen. It was about the parents who'd been turned into criminals, the families destroyed on multiple levels, the way grief had been weaponized to create more grief. Linda Morrison was dead, believing herself a monster when she was really another victim. Margaret Henderson faced years in prison despite being manipulated into her crimes. And somewhere across the country, other broken parents were being recruited to continue the cycle. The trafficking ring was more than a criminal organization. It was a machine that fed on human suffering and manufactured more suffering in return. Vincent and his associates hadn't just stolen children. They'd stolen the very concept of parental love and twisted it into something monstrous. As Thomas prepared to drive to the veterinary hospital to check on Rex, he realized this case would haunt him for the rest of his career. Not because he'd failed to save everyone, but because he'd finally understood how deep human evil could go when it wore the mask of compassion. 6 months later, Thomas stood in the same spot at Union Station where everything had begun, watching Rex work with a new group of children. The German Shepherd moved slowly now, his left hind leg bearing the permanent reminder of 3 bullet wounds that had nearly claimed his life. But his amber eyes remained sharp, his protective instincts undiminished by the ordeal that had almost killed him. The children surrounding Rex weren't travelers catching trains. They were survivors of trafficking rings across the Midwest, brought together for a unique therapy program that paired rescued victims with police dogs who understood trauma. Emily sat closest to Rex, her hand resting on his thick fur as she read aloud from a picture book about brave dogs and the children they protected. "And the dog never gave up," Emily read in her clear 8-year-old voice, "because he knew the little girl needed him to be strong." Jacob, now 6 and bearing only a thin scar along his hairline, giggled as Rex's tail thumped against the floor. The little boy had recovered remarkably well from his physical injuries, though he still clutched his stuffed bear during therapy sessions. The yellow ribbon around the bear's neck had been replaced with a blue one, the color of hope rather than remembrance. "Rex saved us," Jacob announced to the group of children and their therapists. "He knew we were scared even when we couldn't tell anyone. Dogs are magic like that." Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Detective Chen, smiled at Jacob's innocent wisdom. As the program's lead child psychologist, she'd witnessed the healing power of the human-animal bond in ways that traditional therapy couldn't achieve. Rex had become more than a police dog. He was a symbol of protection and unconditional love for children who'd learned too young that not all adults could be trusted. Thomas felt a gentle touch on his shoulder and turned to see Emily's parents, David and Linda Johnson, approaching with expressions of gratitude that still overwhelmed him after all these months. They'd flown in from Iowa for this special occasion, the 6th-month anniversary of their children's rescue and the official launch of Rex's Kids, a nationwide program inspired by his heroism. "Officer Mitchell," David Johnson said, his voice thick with emotion, "we can never thank you enough for bringing our babies home." Linda Johnson's eyes were bright with tears as she watched her children interact with Rex. "Emily talks about you and Rex every day. She says you're the policeman who kept his promise." The words should have brought comfort, but Thomas still carried the weight of how close he'd come to failing completely. Rex had been the real hero, detecting danger when Thomas had missed it, protecting Emily when Thomas was focused elsewhere, sacrificing his own body to ensure the children's safety. Margaret Henderson approached from across the terminal, walking slowly with Dr. Patricia Hernandez, who'd become her court-appointed therapist. Margaret's appearance had changed dramatically over the past 6 months. Her hair was shorter, her face calmer, but her eyes still held the deep sadness of a woman learning to live with the consequences of her choices. The federal judge had sentenced Margaret to 5 years in federal prison, but had allowed her to serve the time through a revolutionary rehabilitation program that paired convicted trafficking accomplices with victim advocacy work. She spent her days counseling other grieving parents, using her own tragic experience to prevent others from being recruited by predators who exploited parental love. "How are they doing?" Margaret asked quietly, nodding toward Emily and Jacob. She maintained a respectful distance, understanding that her presence might be disturbing to the children she'd helped traumatize. "They're resilient," Thomas replied. "Kids often are, especially when they have each other and people who love them unconditionally." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she watched Emily help Jacob pet Rex's head. "I see Sophie in her sometimes," she admitted. "But now I also see Emily, a brave little girl with her own story, her own family, her own life that I had no right to disrupt." The insight represented months of intensive therapy and genuine personal growth. Margaret had finally learned to separate her grief for Sophie from her interactions with other children, to honor her daughter's memory without trying to replace her with someone else's child. Dr. Hernandez spoke quietly to Thomas while Margaret watched the children from afar. "She's made remarkable progress. The guilt will always be there, but she's channeling it into helping others instead of hurting them." She prevented 3 potential recruitment attempts last month by recognizing the warning signs in other bereaved parents. Vincent's trafficking ring had been completely dismantled, leading to 47 arrests across 6 states and the rescue of 31 children. But the psychological damage extended far beyond the immediate victims. Dozens of parents like Margaret had been manipulated into becoming unwilling accomplices, their grief weaponized by predators who understood that desperate love could be more dangerous than hatred. Rex shifted his position, settling more comfortably as Emily continued reading. His recovery had been miraculous. Veterinarians had given him a 20% chance of survival when he'd arrived at the emergency clinic with 3 gunshot wounds. But the German Shepherd's will to live, combined with the best medical care Chicago could provide, had pulled him back from death's threshold. The physical scars were visible, the slight limp, the shaved patches where surgical sites had healed, the way he favored his left side when rising from a lying position. But Rex's spirit remained unbroken, his bond with Thomas stronger than ever, his protective instincts focused now on healing rather than pursuit. Detective Chen approached the group carrying a manila folder that Thomas recognized immediately. Case files. There were always more case files, more missing children, more broken families seeking justice and resolution. "I hate to interrupt," Chen said apologetically, "but we have a situation in Milwaukee. 3 children missing from a group home, and the social worker who was supposed to be watching them has disappeared. The FBI thinks it might be connected to Vincent's operation." Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied new cases involving endangered children, but as he looked down at Rex, he saw his partner's ears perk up with interest rather than anxiety. The German Shepherd was ready to work again, ready to use his unique abilities to protect other children who needed rescue. "Can Rex handle travel?" Thomas asked Dr. Hernandez, though he already knew his partner's answer. The dog's tail had begun wagging at the mention of missing children. Rex understood his purpose with crystal clarity. Emily looked up from her book, sensing the shift in conversation. "Are you and Rex going to help more kids?" she asked with the serious expression she wore when discussing important matters. "That's what we do, sweetheart," Thomas replied, kneeling down to her level. "Rex and I help find children who are lost or scared, just like we helped find you and Jacob." Jacob hugged his stuffed bear tighter and looked at Rex with absolute trust. "Will you bring them home safe like you brought us home?" Rex's amber eyes met Jacob's gaze, and Thomas could swear he saw the dog nod slightly. It was an impossible promise to make. Every case was different. Every situation carried risks that couldn't be predicted or controlled. But Rex's presence, his unwavering dedication to protecting innocent children, made the promise feel achievable. Margaret stepped forward, hesitantly, her voice barely audible. "Officer Mitchell, if there's anything I can do to help, if my experience with how they recruit people could be useful." Thomas studied her face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with desperate hope for redemption. Margaret's insights into the psychological manipulation tactics used by trafficking rings had already proven invaluable in preventing other recruitment attempts. Her testimony had helped convict not just Vincent's organization but similar groups operating across the country. "We'll be in touch," Thomas said, meaning it. Margaret's journey from victim to perpetrator to advocate represented a kind of healing that benefited everyone: herself, the children she now helped protect, and the parents she prevented from making her same tragic mistakes. Emily stood up and wrapped her small arms around Thomas's waist, the same gesture she'd made that terrible day at Union Station when he'd held her while paramedics worked on her brother. But now, her embrace carried gratitude rather than fear, trust rather than desperation. "Thank you for keeping your promise," she whispered into his uniform shirt. Rex rose slowly to his feet, his tail wagging as he prepared for whatever new challenge awaited them. The German Shepherd's recovery had been more than physical. It had been a transformation from a police dog into something approaching a therapy animal, capable of detecting not just danger, but also the specific needs of traumatized children. As Thomas clipped Rex's lead and prepared to leave for Milwaukee, he reflected on how much had changed since that December day when Rex had first detected something wrong with Margaret and the children. The case had nearly destroyed all of them. Jacob shot, Rex almost killed, Emily traumatized, Margaret's life shattered by the consequences of her choices. But from that tragedy had emerged something unprecedented, a program that paired police dogs with trafficking survivors, a national network of advocates who understood both sides of the recruitment process, and a renewed commitment to protecting children not just from predators, but from the systems that allowed predators to flourish. The Christmas carols were no longer playing in Union Station, replaced by the normal ambient sounds of a busy transportation hub. But Thomas could still hear their echo in his memory, a reminder that hope could survive even the darkest circumstances, that healing was possible even after the worst traumas, and that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships, between a damaged cop, a wounded dog, and brave children who refused to give up, could create miracles. Rex's amber eyes looked up at Thomas with perfect understanding. They had work to do, children to find, families to reunite. The next case waited, and with it, the chance to keep promises that mattered more than life itself. This story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when grief threatens to consume everything we hold dear, there's still light to be found in the most unexpected places. Like Thomas, many of us have faced losses that seemed insurmountable: the death of loved ones, children who've grown distant, dreams that never came to fruition. But just as Rex's unwavering loyalty pulled Thomas back from despair and Emily's brave spirit showed Margaret a path to redemption, we too can find purpose in our pain. The beauty isn't in avoiding heartbreak, but in how we choose to heal and help others heal alongside us. Thomas discovered that protecting other people's children couldn't replace Katie, but it honored her memory in ways that isolation never could. Margaret learned that love isn't diminished when shared. It multiplies. At 55, 60, or 65, we're not too old to be heroes in someone else's story. We're not too broken to offer comfort, too tired to stand guard over innocence, or too wounded to love again. Sometimes our greatest victories come not from what we accomplish for ourselves, but from the promises we keep to others, especially the smallest and most vulnerable among us. Every grandchild's laugh, every neighbor child we watch over, every moment we choose compassion over bitterness is our chance to be someone's Rex. Have you ever had an animal companion who seemed to understand your emotions better than people did? How did they help you through difficult times? What moment in your life taught you that helping others could heal your own wounded heart? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.